Across the endless dunes of the North African desert, a land shaped by scorching winds, shifting sands, and a silence that stretched farther than the eye could see, a moment unfolded that would later be remembered by soldiers, historians, and survivors as the most shocking desert ambush of WW2, an event so unbelievable that even those who lived through it struggled to describe it without pausing to question how it had truly happened, a moment where courage, desperation, confusion, and fate collided under the brutal sun of the Sahara. The story begins with an Allied convoy moving steadily across the burning terrain, a long line of trucks, armored cars, supply jeeps, and a handful of light tanks rumbling across the desert floor, carrying food, ammunition, medical supplies, and most importantly, water for thousands of men fighting across North Africa. The men traveling in this convoy were exhausted from weeks of fighting against a well-organized enemy force commanded by experienced desert tacticians who understood every grain of sand, every mountain ridge, every wadi, and every mirage better than the newcomers marching through the heat. The convoy commander, a young but determined officer, had been warned repeatedly that the desert was filled with dangers, not only from enemy troops, but from illusions, tricks that bent the eye and confused the senses, optical distortions created by heat, whirlwinds that wiped away tracks, and windstorms that whispered strange sounds across the dunes, causing even the bravest men to question what they were seeing and hearing. But despite these warnings, the convoy had to move forward, for the war depended on the supplies they carried. Unknown to them, however, a highly skilled enemy reconnaissance unit had been tracking their movement for 2 days, observing their speed, their formation, and their weaknesses, noting the moments when the convoy paused to rest, when the soldiers dismounted to stretch, when the drivers switched positions, and when the gunners grew tired from staring into the blinding sun through their scopes. This reconnaissance team passed their information to a hidden strike group waiting behind a distant ridge, of force that had prepared an ambush more elaborate and more daring than anything attempted in the desert before. As dawn rose over the sand, the convoy pressed ahead, unaware of the trap that lay ahead. The air shimmered with heat even in the early hours, making the dunes appear as shifting waves of gold and bronze. The drivers shielded their eyes, the gunners scanned the horizon, and the officers tried to maintain order while feeling a growing unease that something was wrong. Something felt unnatural about the stillness. Something felt like the desert itself was holding its breath. Then it happened without warning, and so suddenly that even veteran soldiers found themselves frozen for a moment, as if time itself had paused. Along the far ridge, a line of vehicles that had been completely invisible moments earlier rose from behind the dunes. They had been carefully camouflaged with captured Allied equipment, destroyed truck parts, and nets woven with sand-colored fibers. From a distance, they looked like scattered debris, but now they revealed themselves as part of one of the most perfectly executed ambush positions of the war. Before the convoy could react, the hidden force unleashed a wave of fire. A storm of dust, engines, and shouts roared across the desert. The first strike hit the center of the convoy, splitting it in two and forcing the drivers to slam their brakes as explosions shook the ground beneath their tires. The Allied troops tried to organize themselves, but the suddenness of the attack, combined with the blinding sand and roaring engines, made communication almost impossible. The enemy force charged forward in a sweeping arc, a maneuver studied and perfected by desert fighters who relied on speed, precision, and surprise. They knew the terrain perfectly. They knew the weaknesses of the convoy formation, and they knew exactly where to strike, forcing the Allied troops into a chaotic defense under relentless assault. Meanwhile, the dust clouds created by the ambush were so thick that many soldiers could not see more than a few feet ahead. Silhouettes of vehicles emerged, and vanished like ghosts, some exploding moments later, others struggling to escape the trap, only to be knocked out by gunfire from positions they could not detect. The sound of engines blended with the rushing wind, the thundering guns, and the desperate shouts of men trying to regroup. But within this chaos, something extraordinary happened, something that would later be described as the turning point of the event. Despite the overwhelming surprise, an Allied artillery unit positioned at the rear of the convoy managed to hold their ground, refusing to retreat even as enemy forces closed in around them. The gunners worked with astonishing speed, loading and firing their cannons with mechanical precision, even though their visibility was nearly zero. Their aim was guided not by sight, but by instinct, training, and courage. Their shells began landing with remarkable accuracy, striking the ridge where the ambushers had set up their heavy support weapons. The explosions disrupted the enemy coordination, buying precious seconds for the rest of the convoy to reorganize. The artillery crews continued firing until their barrels glowed red with heat, refusing to abandon their posts despite mounting casualties. Inspired by this stand-a group of armored cars pushed forward, attempting to break through the enemy lines to create an escape corridor. They advanced through the swirling storm of dust and smoke, their engines roaring as they fired at anything that moved, refusing to let the convoy be destroyed. In the desert, they created a wedge, a gap however small, that allowed some of the damaged trucks to begin escaping from the deadly trap. At the same time, a small team of infantrymen launched a daring counterattack on foot, charging through the sand toward the enemy flank, their boots sinking into the dunes, their uniforms drenched in sweat, their rifles clutched tightly. Despite the overwhelming heat, they moved with determination, hoping to disrupt the ambushers long enough for reinforcements to arrive. And reinforcements were indeed on their way. Miles to the south, an Allied patrol heard the distant rumble of artillery echoed by wind across the desert. Recognizing the signature of a large-scale battle, they immediately turned north, racing toward the sound with full speed, their vehicles bouncing violently over rocks and dunes as they pushed their engines to the limit to reach the trapped convoy before it was wiped out entirely. Back at the ambush site, the battle raged with incredible intensity. The desert floor shook from explosions, vehicles burned, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. The wind carried the heat across the battlefield, making it feel like the air itself was on fire, but the soldiers kept fighting, refusing to surrender, refusing to allow the convoy to be destroyed. Their resilience surprised even the ambushers, who had expected quick victory. Instead, they found themselves locked in a fierce struggle against determined defenders who refused to yield. Slowly and with tremendous effort, the combined pressure of the artillery stand, the armored car breakthrough, and the infantry counterattack began to shift the momentum of the battle. The enemy forces realized that their window for total victory was closing and that reinforcements would soon arrive. They attempted one final push, but the Allied defenders held their line, fighting with the strength of desperation and hope. When the Allied patrol finally arrived and charged into combat with fresh vehicles and ammunition, the ambushers realized the tide had turned. They began to withdraw, retreating back behind the ridges and disappearing into the desert just as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind burning wreckage, abandoned equipment, and the stunned survivors of the convoy, who could hardly believe they were still alive. As the dust settled, the scale of the ambush became clear. The damage was devastating, but the convoy was not destroyed thanks to the incredible courage of the artillery crews, the relentless push of the armored cars, the daring infantry flank attack, and the timely arrival of reinforcements. The ambush that was meant to be a perfect trap instead became a legendary moment of survival, a moment that would be Studied for decades as an example of resilience under impossible odds, the survivors gathered around the wrecked vehicles, their faces covered with dust, sweat, and exhaustion.